Welcome back to the Veterans Voice podcast. Today on the show, I've brought on Nicole Weis, a licensed professional counselor and licensed addiction counselor. Nicole has always been fascinated with the psychology sector, but was inspired to branch out into trauma work when one of her loved ones was directly impacted by PTSD following their service in the military. Her career has taken her from being the lead therapist on a mobile crisis response team to managing the Milestones Mental Health Clinic, a resource center located within the Lyda Hill Institute for Human Resilience at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Nicole is also responsible for founding the GRIT program, or Greater Resiliency Toolkit, an online course that she describes as basic first aid for social support. Now, my intention with this interview is to show that conversations like these don't need to be scary. We're all struggling. We all feel alone at times, but there are experts out there who are willing to help us. The single most salient piece of information that I've gleaned from this interview is that in a world with an abundance of healing methods such as meditation, pharmaceutical drugs, or professional counseling, the most potent and effective healing modality is social support. This is the Veterans Voice podcast, and this is a reminder that you're not alone. Nicole Weis, thanks for coming on the Veterans Voice podcast. How are you doing?
Absolutely. I'm doing really well.
Just tell us a little bit about yourself. You're extremely highly educated and very savvy in the psychology realm, specifically like trauma, veteran trauma, PTSD, things like that. So yes. Just tell us how you got here.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I have a master's in clinical psychology with an emphasis in trauma, as well as bachelor's degree in psychology and business administration. I like to say it's a BA, BS. I was a badass bullshitter getting through college.
I've never heard that. I like it.
Right. But then went on to master's in clinical psychology here in Colorado Springs at UCCS. While I was in the program, Dr. Charles Benight was my mentor for the program. I actually extended my college from 2 years to 3 years so that he would be my mentor because he was on a sabbatical at the time. And in talking with him and really understanding his vision and his trajectory, he explained this vision he had called the Milestones Resilience Care Center. And the idea was how can we treat trauma in this whole person, very holistic way. And in the 10 years ago, that was a vision and that was an idea. And I absolutely really gleaned onto that and really was excited about what he was thinking. And so I just never left. In one way or form, I stayed connected to Dr. Benight. And then when the Institute launched in literally March of 2020, March 20th of 2020, I had the opportunity to come into the Institute as a full-time director. And so I took that. And so I've been with the Institute for going on 5 years now, but connected in some form ever since my master's program. Throughout those years, I also became a licensed professional counselor, so an LPC, as well as a licensed addictions counselor. I specialize in treating trauma in my individual therapy. And then before I came into a director role, I also worked at a crisis center where I worked at both with individuals walking into the center who were experiencing any number of crises. And then I also had the really cool opportunity to be part of what was called the community response team, where I rode along with a police officer and a paramedic, and we responded to mental health calls throughout the community. So people who were calling 911 because somebody was having thoughts of suicide or they themselves were having, a crisis or a traumatic experience. And so within that team, we were able to respond usually before other police entities or in addition to them. And we were able to work with that individual and get them help more times than not.
Wow. What a career. Yeah. Well, I was telling you right before we started recording, my whole intention with bringing you on and kind of having these discussions on a veterans-based podcast is to kind of, get a better grasp of why PTSD and trauma create the type of reactions, we'll call them that they do.
Sure.
It's my understanding that PTSD is kind of just misunderstood or misplaced emotions in a way. Like a lot of it, could be losing buddies, losing friends, losing soldiers, and that's an aspect of PTSD. It could also be, more of the moral injury type of incident there with like, being in firefights in Afghanistan, seeing people being killed, those types of moral injuries. And it's all very confusing.
Yes. Yes.
So my whole intention here is to bring on, yourself and people like you who are very smart in the subject to really try and get to the bottom of it and just help veterans in the process. So
absolutely.
Let's get started on just how you got into psychology and becoming a therapist in the first place. What drew you to it?
Sure. So I come from a very big family. I have 9 siblings. It was a yours, mine, and ours situation.
Yeah.
And my stepbrother, after 9/11, he turned 18, 19, right around that time. And of course, 9/11 and that feeling of, patriotism and camaraderie and this drive to be there for the country. He enlisted Air Force, and then throughout the years experienced some pretty heavy, significant trauma during his career, to the point where a lot of his paperwork was, blacked out, right? He literally can't talk about it.
Wow.
When he got out of the Air Force, the military, he didn't have a good coping style, didn't have a good coping mechanism. At the time, unfortunately, what he turned to was emailing the VA. And he would email and say, this is what I'm experiencing and I need help and please help me. And no, he never got responses. And so at some point, he kind of turned this into a journal of sorts. He would send an email and it was his way of just kind of dumping out his emotions. Unfortunately, those emotions got stronger and stronger, especially as nobody responded. At one point, he sent in an email essentially saying, if I don't get help, something bad's going to happen. The next day, he was arrested for terrorism.
What?
Yeah. So for him, right. So for him to be desperately seeking help and hearing, blank wall, nothing. And then here you're being arrested.
Yeah.
Luckily, this was in South Carolina. Luckily, after he, was sent to prison, he fell into a veterans trauma court. And so was able to work through that system, was able to finally get his help, get recovery. Now he lives this beautiful nomad life in Idaho. He's so happy.
Good for him.
Right. But he had to go through this horrible experience. And again, begging for help before something kind of fell into him. I'm incredibly grateful for veterans trauma courts. I work with the one here locally, or our clinic does. And thank God, because I don't know what his life would look like had he not been able to fall into that program.
Wow. Yeah. That's a wild story. I can't believe that.
Yeah. And when it happened, I was in college. I had already been interested in psychology and just interested in the mind, but that really turned my trajectory to trauma,
right?
Specifically working with veterans and wanting to make sure that didn't happen again.
Yeah.
And so I completed my undergrad, was kind of looking through the country and found that UCCS is one of the only programs at the time that had a trauma focus. So Colorado is actually my home. Right. Cool. Lived in South Carolina for a few years to get those bachelor's degrees, but came home in a sense to Colorado, went through the program here, completely fell in love with the world of trauma and healing trauma. Started working a lot with emergency responders as well. My thesis is on suicide among firefighters. And then here I am. So just kind of kept snowballing from there.
Wow. Well, good for you. And I'm sorry for your brother, but I'm really happy to hear he's just out in Idaho.
Oh, he's so good now. Yes, he's got chickens and goats. He's so happy.
I relate to that, man. I think all of us veterans in a way just kind of want to get like 5 acres out in the mountains and just be like,
yep,
we're here if you need
he's good.
me.
Yes.
Well, what was it early? You got into psychology for one reason or another. Then you really started to dive deep into trauma healing. What were some things you were learning early in those days that really just solidified this decision to, I'm going to help people heal from trauma?
Sure. And kind of 2 things. One is PTSD is actually the only diagnosis that requires you to go through something incredibly life-altering. The only one, right? We don't have to have that for depression, anxiety, bipolar, none of that. And in thinking of it that way, it's not that something's wrong with you. It means that something got stuck along the way of recovery, right? And so to kind of frame it differently, and that's really what this program and Dr. Benight helped shape, there's just such a misconception that going through trauma, having PTSD means that I did something wrong. And when we think about trauma healing, it's really reversing that story to say you did nothing wrong. It just got stuck. And for whatever reason, it just gets stuck. And there's lots of different theories, the chicken before the egg kind of theories of what comes first, but you didn't do anything wrong. So to have that perspective, I think was really powerful for me. The other is, I say this, I do trainings all the time, and I say this in my trainings, we have dumb, smart brains. Right? Like your brain is incredible. You're so equipped. You're so capable of amazing, incredible things. And your brain is dumb at the end of the day because it will always just try to help you survive.
Right. Must eat, must sleep, must connect.
Survive. Right? Absolutely. And so when we think about recovery, we can retrain the brain in so many really, really fascinating ways. We just need to rewrite how it wants you to survive. Mm-hmm. So that's really how I fell into the teaching aspect of what I do and teaching your dumb, smart brain. And how do you hack that system for yourself in a way that benefits you?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking, I agree. PTSD, you feel like you've done something wrong. Why do you think that happens? Why do you think we revert to this feeling of guilt when we have PTSD?
Because I think there's so much that so much control that kind of gets taken away, the body and the brain. And again, in this attempt to just survive, it kind of overrides your rational thought. And so when it overrides that in a way that doesn't feel good, I think we as just a human species start to think, well, then I did something wrong, right? Or I didn't do it the right way. This thing happened and I should have recovered a different way. I should have done something different. And yeah, maybe there's like a sense of truth to the fact that there are coping strategies that are really effective and really helpful, and maybe we didn't engage in those. But sometimes you can do everything right, and it still happens anyway. I really like to kind of think about PTSD as more of just the post-traumatic stress. I hate the disorder word for it.
Me too.
I think it becomes such a label. PTSD is never intended to be a lifelong diagnosis. It's intended to be healed from, but we just never really think of it that way, I think. And so I really like PTS, post-traumatic stress. A couple of years ago, maybe six years ago or so now, I learned about the term post-traumatic injury or traumatic injury. And there's a whole theory called the stress injury continuum that I really glean onto and I really work a lot in my trainings with. But to think about your trauma symptoms not as a thing you did wrong, not as this disorder, but simply an injury on the body, it really helps us think about it a different way. My husband, my partner, was a federal corrections officer for 8 years. We had our first daughter 4 years ago, and he went back to work after his 3 months of paternity leave. Immediately got saddled with a 16-hour shift, came home that night and said, I'm not doing this anymore. Yeah. Right. And so we really thought about things differently. But during that 8 years, he experienced some significant trauma. And I was in this program, and as I was talking to him about this different way to think about this injury, he said, that's the first time that I can think about what I went through and feel okay with it. Because it doesn't mean it's a diagnosis, doesn't mean it's a disorder, doesn't mean something's wrong with me. It simply means I've been injured. And if I've been injured, I can recover, I can heal. Mm-hmm. So I really like to think about it that way. And again, that's where a lot of the trauma research is kind of gleaning onto as well. Yeah,
I'd love to dive into this a little bit because like I said at the beginning, I just believe PTSD is misunderstood or misplaced emotion somehow. Yeah. And when you're labeled, with a disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, I feel like that's adding to these emotions that are already hard to deal with. And now I have a disorder. Well, that sounds like forever. I guess I'm just screwed up and now I don't have motivation to do it because I'm just this way. I have a disorder.
Exactly.
When I think of disorder, like I'm not highly educated, but like a disorder, you're born with a disorder or like you develop this disorder. Post-traumatic stress comes from an event. It's an injury to your psyche or your internal nervous system even. So how can we maybe relabel this to, cater more towards a veteran or someone who's struggling with PTSD that makes it more understanding and more maybe enable them to work on themselves a little bit better?
Yeah, there's a trend of kind of reframing when somebody comes in seeking help, instead of saying, what's wrong with you, right? Which is a very medicalized model of way we look at life. You go into a doctor's office and you immediately talk about what's wrong with you. To reframe it a little bit to say, what happened, right? Even just that takes away the personal feeling of it, right? Of like, again, that I did something wrong, right? Instead of to say, well, what happened? What happened in your life? What happened to bring you to this point right here? What's going on in your body? That I think immediately kind of helps reshift it a little bit.
Yeah, because even just answering the question, what's wrong? And if you just answer it, you're admitting something's wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think there's this part I don't know the brain science behind, but I have noticed in a lot of the work I do, our brain tends to skew towards the negative. There's a whole theory, cognitive behavioral therapy, that talks about our maladaptive thinking patterns. And more often than not, when we get into a maladaptive, just not helpful thinking pattern, it's into the negative space. To shift that to say what happened allows for a different perspective. And it allows us to kind of get out of the negative and just to say, this is the reality, right? That my buddy died. That's the reality. And I'm having a hard time recovering from it. So it just shifts the way we think about things. And I think it eases up a little bit of that pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like it. I really like the post-traumatic injury. Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
'Cause it really is an injury to, I don't know, would it be your nervous system? Would it be your brain? You know, it's this like psychological thing that's happened. I'm just thinking, in Afghanistan, the truck in front of you gets blown up. Like, you have watched that happen. You're completely fine. But like, you're going to remember that for the rest of your life. That's an injury as far as I'm concerned. That's not a disorder developing.
No, exactly. So I absolutely love the way to think of it that way. We also have this misconception of, right, like it's all in your head. Well, the head's attached to the body. If it's all in your head, it's all in your body. Right. And we can see that time and time again. But in our society, we've just separated the two issues so severely that it's hard to kind of think about it as the whole person. But what's going on in my head is impacting every cell in my body. Right. And we can feel that on like the bad days mentally, our body feels worn down. When we're sick, our cognitions aren't as effective. Like, this is incredibly in tandem. So, right, when we think about trauma, it's impacting your nervous system. It's impacting your hormones. It's impacting all of the signals going through your body. Again, the brain is just trying to survive. It's just not doing it in helpful ways anymore. So when we see somebody blown up right in front of us, the brain gets cued of like, oh, wait a minute, that just happened. That could happen to me. I now need to fight, flight, freeze, whatever. Now, what's really, really important to think about and fascinating for military and emergency responder cultures is that your training will tell you otherwise, right? And so while the rest of your body is screaming, run, 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 your training says, nope, stay.
Yeah.
Right? Keep going, keep moving forward. Eventually, the brain's going to catch up to that and say, yeah, but I need to survive from that, right? And so our brain kind of goes into this really fascinating survival mode until it doesn't need to survive anymore. And then it says, hey, guess what? All I've been ignoring and neglecting. And that's when we see this flood of symptoms tend to come in.
Yeah, that has to be like its own thing. So let's just linger on this example. The truck in front of us gets blown up. We've seen this very traumatic event. We now have a post-traumatic injury that we're going to have to deal with. But like you're saying, our job tells us to suppress that. Like, we still have 13 more miles of road to clear. We have to keep doing this mission. Like they medevac those guys, they're gone. We have to continue pushing. So how is maybe that a different aspect of PTSD that, I think this probably is mostly prevalent to the military, but it's pushing through those very difficult situations where, you probably should have went and talked to somebody about that day, but you pushed it to the rest of the deployment, and then you got home and went on vacation, and then you came back to work, and next thing you know, 5 years goes by and you've never even addressed seeing your friends get blown up in front of you. So how is that an aspect of PTSD?
Well, let's think of it still as the injury perspective, right? Let's say that you run a marathon. And as you're running the marathon on mile 12, right? Marathon, 26 miles, mile 12, 13, you step on a rock, your ankle twists, your knee twinges. That's an injury, right? Something happened, something changed. But you're on this marathon. And so you're like, it's fine. I'm just going to keep running through it. And maybe for a while we keep running and that pain goes away, right? Because endorphins and all of the good stuff, dopamine, we keep running on this injury and we're fine. And maybe at like mile 20, 25, that's starting to ache. But again, our destination, we're only a couple miles away. Let's just keep going. And so we keep going. And we run the marathon and we get done and we have this victory, right? Of like, I feel so good. And, my body's tired, but I did it. I accomplished it. I'm great. And then the next couple of weeks go by and your brain and your body are starting to go into that recovery perspective. And you injured your ankle and your knee, right? And so eventually what's going to start to happen is that the brain and the body say, hey, we're recovered now. The marathon's done. Guess what? And then we wake up and our knee is swollen and our ankle hurts and it's harder and harder to walk. Now, as human beings, we have this incredible power of choice. I can choose to ignore that all I want, right? And I might continue to run marathons and continue to tell myself, it's fine, I'll run it off, or I'll ice it between marathons, but it's fine. But I have to acknowledge, part of me has to acknowledge, if I keep doing this, it could get worse. Now the body, is elastic and incredible, and maybe we run it off. Maybe it's fine again, but maybe it's not. And eventually when we decide I'm done running marathons, the body and the brain are going to catch up to that injury. So let's flip it back to post-traumatic stress. It's the same kind of path and choices we have. We can acknowledge something's changed, something's different. I just saw somebody get blown up in front of me. That's not normal, right? My brain and my body are going to have some type of reaction about that. But I'm on this deployment. I'm on this mission. I have to keep going. I'm just going to keep running, right? Keep going, keep going, keep going. And I have to go on to the next mission and the next and the next. And then what often, maybe not often, but what can happen is now I'm done with my military career, right? I'm transitioning out, and the brain goes, oh, we're not running marathons anymore? Guess what? And all of these things start flooding back. And the brain realizes now that I'm on this quote unquote safe ground and I don't have to go back to survival mode, I can now let these injuries catch up. And sometimes, especially if we don't have the coping and the social support to catch us, that fall is really hard.
It seems like it would be easier to ignore what we're describing in the PTSD example versus the marathon example. Because if my foot's broken, that's going to keep swelling. And eventually I'm not going to be able to walk. But in the, mental trauma, the mental injury, I feel like that would be easier to ignore.
I think potentially both.
Yeah.
I think one is more socially accepted than the other, right? I think if we stopped and paused and recognized those changing signs, when I think about stress injury continuum, we call them vital, like early and late changing vital signs. Your body's telling you somehow, like maybe you're sleeping less and less, you're having nightmares, you're snippier at work, right? It's no longer 1 or 2 beers with friends. It's a whole 6-pack to calm down, right? We are seeing some of those very subtle injuries, but we've normalized them enough that we just continue to ignore them. And that's easier to ignore than kind of radiating pain in our body.
Okay. Yeah,
and I think a lot of that, again, is the stigma and how we socially accept those.
Right. Yeah, you kind of just answered it, but that's what I was going to ask next is like, you break your foot, it's going to swell. Eventually, you're not going to be able to walk. What's the PTSD equivalent of this? If we start ignoring our symptoms, or maybe we don't even know what the symptoms are, but if we just push that down, I keep having this nightmare of that convoy in Afghanistan. It was 10 years ago, but like, that's just stupid. Why do I keep having that dream?
It's all in my head.
Yeah.
Right?
How does that show up? Like the broken foot, you can't walk. PTSD, you ignore it. How does it start to show up?
It often shows up in isolation. So we cut off friends and family, especially when there's a level of like shame involved, or again, something's wrong with me involved. So we isolate.
Yeah. Let's dive into each example. Why do you think we isolate?
I actually don't know the science behind this one, but I'm fascinated by it because research has shown us time and time again, over and over, social support is one of the most powerful mechanisms of recovery.
Absolutely.
In front of almost every other recovery avenue, social support. And at the same time, when we are stressed and burned out and experience trauma, oftentimes one of the first things to go is our social connection. We choose to isolate or we withdraw from other people. And I think there's shame involved. I think there's, negative feelings. We don't want somebody to think about us differently. We don't want to come off differently. And so we just choose to isolate, right? I'd rather just nobody see me this way.
Yeah.
And I don't know the science behind why, but I find it fascinating that we as a human species do the exact opposite of what is the most helpful thing for us to do.
Yeah.
And we are co-regulating species. We are social creatures, co-regulating species. And so we will feel our best when we have some level of social connection, even if it's just 1 or 2 people. And yet we do this, we isolate.
Yeah. I wonder if this is like a kind of an old thing just, from thousands of years ago when, we didn't have technology and it was more like just every man for himself. I've been doing a lot of work and having a lot of conversations around equine therapy.
Yeah.
And something I've heard is that horses do is if they have a horse within the pack, let's say a pack of 10, and there's one horse that's anxious, angry, restless, they will start to reject that horse because it's essentially this false signal of danger.
Yeah.
Like, why is that horse anxious? And then all the other horses look around. There's nothing to be anxious about. Okay, let's go back to eating. And then he's still anxious. I wonder if that's it.
That's actually a great train of thought.
Yeah,
there.
maybe if we're anxious, we're scared, we're fearful, we have these PTSD symptoms, we're scared that the rest of the pack is going to reject us, so we just do it before they can.
That's a really great theory behind it. And again, we're co-regulating species, so it makes sense if like the pack isn't wanting to regulate to the anxious, right? And we might choose to isolate that.
When in reality, the pack probably just wants to help you. You just have to ask.
A million times over.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's that easy, I feel like.
Yeah.
But it's scary.
Yeah, absolutely.
So isolation.
We see things like extreme mood, right? So that oftentimes, again, because we tend to swing towards the negative, depression, anxiety, anger. We see a lot of anger. Anger is interesting because I think it's just an easier to access emotion for some. That feels more normalized than anxious and sad.
Yeah, I'd love to get into the anger aspect of this. Why is that kind of just the blanket emotion?
So when we think about emotions, we kind of have these like kind of three. There's something called the feelings wheel. It's cool if you look it up.
Yeah, it's very detailed.
Yeah. So feelings wheel kind of talks about these primary emotions, and that's happiness, sadness, anger, fear, and I think there's one or two more. Disgust is one. So then those are primary, and then in an outer ring, there are some of these kind of more accurate emotions. Like you're not just angry, you're frustrated. And then in this final outer ring, there's even more detailed. So you're not just angry, you're not just frustrated, you're feeling rejected. I think anger is an easier word to say, an easier feeling in a sense to tap into than admitting you feel rejected. And then when we think about gender differences, male and masculine that tends to be the more normalized emotion. Boys just get angry, and we normalize that a lot easier than boys showing fear, boys showing, sadness, right? In women, it's the opposite. We've much more normalized sadness than we have normalized women feeling angry. So I think some of that is just our societal perceptions and normalization as well.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can normalize that and not like swing all the way in the other direction. And then we'd have angry women and sad men, and then we have to go back.
Right.
Like, hopefully we can just regulate.
Yeah. I like to say that you're profoundly human. You're going to have bad days, and you're going to have anger, and you're going to have sadness, and it's all okay, right? It's the way you choose to kind of be in that time.
Yeah, I think anger, it's such a weird one, but in a way, maybe mostly in the masculine, but when we feel sad, we feel vulnerable, we feel emotional, that might make us angry. So then we just take it out on the people or the circumstance that we're in at that time.
Absolutely.
When in reality, we're just sad and scared to say, like, can I just hug you for a minute?
Yeah.
We get angry instead.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Again, how we normalize it in our society.
So how else might this show up?
I would say that, the third one is unfortunately suicide, right? And we see that in incredibly high numbers in our military and emergency responder populations. And that one's complicated because we can't go back to somebody who died by suicide and ask why and what happened and what could we have done to stop you. Suicide research really, really relies on notes that people leave behind, as well as people who have attempted but did not die by suicide to kind of go back and try to ask what was going on. But it's a really, really hard space to research. And so we have a lot of theories. We have a lot of guesses as to why somebody can choose to take their life. But it's a very complicated answer, I think.
Yeah.
One of the analogies, I'm a big analogy person. One of the analogies I heard several years ago that I really talk about a lot in the trainings I do is, imagine going through your life, and every time you experience a significant hardship, it's like a book stacked on your arms, right? And you think about, as you go through your life, another book, another book, another book. Or sometimes it's one or two books, but they're like really thick suckers, right? And really heavy. And you can carry these books, right? If you imagine like 7 or 8 books on your forearms, you can carry that for quite a while. And eventually you're going to carry it for so long that when given the opportunity, or when you think about the opportunity to set it down, you kind of forget that you could ask for help. You kind of forget that I could like lean and take 1 or 2 books off. Or I could, again, ask you to kind of take a book off of, or something, or I could go and ask for help and say, holy crap, I'm carrying so much weight. Can you help? Because we've been carrying it for so long, it's so heavy, we're so exhausted that we just drop the books, right? And so again, it's not a perfect theory of suicide. It's not even a real theory, but it's an analogy of what that can sometimes feel like is I've just been carrying this for so long.
Yeah.
It's so heavy. I'm so tired. I'd rather just drop it. And I forget that there's so many ways I could ask for help instead.
So these books are representing traumatic events in your life, maybe?
Yeah, traumatic events, hardships, whatever that might be.
I'm just trying to further your analogy because I love analogies too. What if, I have 10 books and they're just getting so heavy? I feel like in trauma work and understanding PTSD, you have to almost relive those situations sometimes. And, EMDR is a perfect example of that. CBT, almost exposure therapy. So what if you were able to set down 9 books and then now you're just reading one.
Yeah.
And so now you've read that book, you can set it down for good and pick up one more instead of just throwing them down or feeling overwhelmed that you have 10 books to read. Just break it down one at a time.
Exactly. And that's what a therapist does with you, right? And they also, by the way, when you start therapy, they don't usually say like, okay, let's take the hardest, most heaviest book, right? They say, okay, let's start in the middle. Let's get a little bit of this weight off. And then as that feels easier and easier, as your self-efficacy increases, then let's tackle this big book, the one that you've been holding the longest.
Yeah, therapists definitely differ because I've had a therapist ask me what's the hardest thing I've ever been through, like on the first session.
Not great. I will remind everybody listening that you can choose your therapist.
Yeah, I've been through a couple. Been with one for 2 years now. He's awesome. So,
good. Yeah. But yeah, similar to like, we have this empowerment to like choose our doctor. And if it's not a good doctor fit, we're like, okay, get lost. I'm going to find another one. And for some reason, we don't always have that conception with therapy, and you find your therapist, right?
Sure.
Like research has also shown us that above anything else that a therapist can do, the therapeutic rapport, how I get along with my therapist, the most effective thing.
Absolutely.
So if you don't get along, if you don't feel that connection, and that's why in-person therapy can be extra powerful because there's a connection that happens in co-regulating species. If they don't find that connection, find somebody else because there's a whole gambit. We all have different levels of expertise, and you'll find that connection. But don't give up just because one fit didn't work.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that because, I'm a firm believer in having, that 1 or 2 friends to hey, we just vent like every other week or once a month. Like I know I got a buddy, we've been best friends for probably 12 years now. We call each other probably every other week and it's just a dump. And then at the end, we're like, well, I'm glad you're here. You're doing well, but we're just there for each other. And I think that's what a therapist, can provide plus, the academic knowledge of what you're actually going through. But it's really that connection. So,
oh yeah, I would say 50% of my job is just letting somebody get it out of their body. And then the other 50% is the sounding board, the reflection, the skills piece. But there is so much power behind just getting it out of the body.
USAA is celebrating over 100 years of service to our military community. In 1922, it was a group of soldiers that started USAA to insure each other's vehicles when no one else would. Since then, USAA has grown to over 13 million members strong, and through it all, one thing has remained. USAA is still serving the military community and their families. With their launch of Face the Fight Coalition to counter veteran suicide, we are proud to have USAA as a sponsor of the Veterans Voice podcast. Yeah, we were on, the three ways PTSD shows up. The third one was suicide. Could we get into your thesis a little bit about suicide in firefighters, was it?
Yeah.
What were some of your findings in that?
Yeah. So my dissertation, not my dissertation, a thesis only. My thesis looked at the interpersonal theory of suicide. And that's one of a few theories that exist on suicide. What that theory says is that there are 3 components that come to play when somebody chooses to take lethal suicidal action. And so that differs between somebody who kind of has these kind of like pseudo attempts, like it takes some pills, but not enough to actually, be lethal. So lethal, those 3 components are thwarted belongingness. So feeling like I don't belong with my family, I don't belong in my community. This is something we see strongly in military and emergency responders is I don't belong with my unit. Burdensomeness. So perceived burdensomeness is the second. Oftentimes this can stem from having an injury. So I can't contribute as much as I could, or I'm in a position where I'm not as productive. I'm not as big of a value, quote unquote, to the team. So belongingness, burdensomeness. And then the last one is acquired capability for lethal suicidal action. So what that says is that this person has become desensitized to the idea of death. So who right? So who becomes desensitized? Military emergency responders.
Yeah.
And because, walking into your job on a day-to-day basis, there is a knowledge that this job can take my life. And you're seeing death and dying. Right?
This just opened a whole new door for me. I've never thought of that.
Yeah. So it's a really fascinating theory that combines these 3 components. And again, it doesn't answer everybody because we can't go back and ask, but it does fit for a lot. And so what my thesis looked into is how does this interpersonal theory of suicide connect in with firefighters, because of the family mentality there. And then what we also did is we looked at social cognitive theory, which is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the voice inside you that says, I believe in myself. I believe I can do this. It's the voice that keeps pushing us on and creates goals and helps us meet those goals. And so what we were looking at is, does increased self-efficacy, this idea that I believe in myself, how does that moderate or change components of that interpersonal theory of suicide? And what we found with these firefighters, I think it was a little over 100 firefighters we looked at across the country. And we found that within these measures that we were looking at, social support was the highest protective mechanism. That social support mediated the effects of everything else.
I mean, that eliminates the first one of thwarted belonging, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
If I feel like I at least have somebody that I can connect with, that I can talk with, then it helps reduce the rest of it.
Yeah. I'm trying to think why that happens, because I relate to that. I've had this conversation with a bunch of veterans, and I didn't really think anyone else thought this, but it's like you join the military, you want to become, an airborne ranger. And then you go through the process and you wanted to become an airborne ranger because those guys were so cool. You really admired what they were doing. You wanted to jump out of planes. You wanted the cool.
Superman.
Yeah, exactly. And then you make it and you have this imposter syndrome a little bit, and that might not ever go away, because I relate to that through and through in both of my jobs. I always felt like, you guys are the cool guys. I'm just here.
Right.
But at the same, like we had the same qualifications, if not, more or less in some areas. So I wonder why. Would you agree with that? That probably exists in the firefighter realm too. I want to be a firefighter. I want to serve the community. I looked up to, fire trucks as a little kid. Like I just remember it. Now I am that. And you have this imposter syndrome. I wonder if that is kind of the start of this.
It certainly could be. Yeah, I could see that. Of I don't belong, even though you tell me I belong, even though I have the same qualifications, I don't belong.
Right.
And then when when we have reduced social support in combination of all of that, that can really intensify that.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm telling you, everybody listening, social support, man. It's the best thing you can do. Even if it's just one person, even if it's your dog, some kind of social connection. It makes such a huge difference.
My dogs understand everything I tell them.
Yes, dogs are designed to. Horses too.
Horses too.
Cats not so much, but you get the rare ones.
I'm not a cat person either, but yeah. So what else did you kind of dive into in your thesis there? Or was that kind of the main three?
That was the main three. Okay. And then I discovered that I don't love research myself. And so I really like applied. So I was kind of like itching to be like, okay, well, I found this out. Now what? What do I do with it next? And so that's how I got then into the clinical work. And didn't go on to my PhD. But if I went on, that's something I would have continued to look into.
Okay. Let's tell us about working in that mobile unit.
Yeah.
I think you have a lot of insight that you could share with people, because I don't know, it's just becoming more and more often to get that phone call of someone saying like, I'm suicidal. I don't know where else to go. It's 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and you're the call. So maybe share some insight on, maybe recommendations if someone was ever in that position. What are some things you saw and how did you help those people?
Yeah.
Let's just kind of get into this a little bit. I'm very interested.
It's really interesting because a lot of the work, and I've worked with hundreds of people. I mean, so in Colorado, it's called an M1, which is the 72-hour hold. I've probably written 200 of those, right? So I've admitted a lot of people, and the vast majority being for suicidal thoughts. It's fascinating that I think the vast majority of people that I've worked with who have had suicidal thoughts or, thoughts of suicide, if they're asking for help, it's because they don't really want to do this. Right. And it's the kind of this, not this last ditch effort. That's not what I mean by it. But this call to just say, recognize this, right? That this is so hard. This is so heavy. I'm exhausted. Recognize this. And so, oftentimes if somebody's calling, it's because they're willing to get help. Now, it doesn't always manifest that way once you get there, right? Then when they realize, well, wait a minute, I don't want to go to a hospital. I don't want to go, that's scary. Right. Of course it's scary, right? And a 72-hour hold is somebody coming and saying, I'm taking your rights away for 72 hours. That is terrifying. And 9 times out of 10, it's the best thing that somebody needed, right? It's that breath. I had early in my career when I was going to some of my first calls and I was writing those first M1s, I had a mentor, her name was Lori, that I was working with, and I said, this is so hard. Like as the therapist, this is such a huge decision to make for somebody. And she said, it will always stand out. She said, you're offering them a breath. You're saying, let me get you somewhere safe and breathe. Right? Remember what's around you. Remember who's rallying. Remember what resources you have. Take a breath. right? And so that's really what I kind of gleaned onto with every other call I went to. But yeah, that was always something. So more often than not, if somebody's calling, even if it's don't come, please come is usually right the kind of the underneath of that. But yeah, I worked with a lot of people who were really there on the cusp, and to give them a breath was really powerful.
Yeah. So what kind of on the spot, I'm sure the calls varied from like,
Vastly.
gun to my head versus like crying and versus like, I'm just a little bit sad. But, what are some of the, maybe tips and tricks on helping someone in that, I just showed up 2 minutes into this person was suicidal. How did you kind of help them breathe?
Yeah. So I've said it a few times, we are a co-regulating species, right? And so what that means is if you've ever held like a 10-month-old baby or younger, and you smile and they smile, this is mirror neurons activating, right? And we never lose our mirror neurons. We will always try to do what's happening in front of us. And 80% of the time, that works really well. So one of the best mechanisms I had was just to come in and be a very calming presence. And usually we would sit and we would talk and we would just say, what's going on? How's life been? What's bringing you here in this moment? Let's simply be here together. And being able to come in with that really calming perspective. One of the things I loved about the community response team is the police officer we had and the paramedic were also specifically trained in trauma and responding to these kinds of situations. And so they also had a very calming demeanor. And some of the best officers I worked with actually just left us alone, which is probably the best they could do because they're such they're a presence in themselves. But more often than not, it was coming in and just saying, you're safe here in this moment. We don't even have to think about the next hour. Let's just be here in this moment and let's bring ourselves down a little bit. And then talking about all of the vast amount of help that's available. Sometimes it's like, let's just get you connected to family. Let's get your social support coming, right? I would work with kids a lot and it was like, hey, let's bring in the adult that you feel safe with and let's have that social support piece. Other times it's let's cue in a therapist, right? And maybe that was me in that moment. Maybe that was getting them connected to the next therapist. Maybe that was inpatient, help and getting with some professionals, or other resources that are available. Battle buddies, right? Like let's call your friends. Let's just show you how much love and support you actually do have. 9 times out of 10, that was the most effective.
Yeah. So just listening, probably.
Just listening. Because again, oftentimes it's just the scream of, I just need you to recognize how hard this is.
Yeah.
So for somebody to come in and say, I hear you, and I'm here in this space with you.
Maybe a little personal question here. I was a medic for 6 years. For me, helping people and being in that moment affected me in a way. Never did I have a situation where I couldn't help someone because my training was so elaborate. I literally would just go into tunnel vision to help this person until, I was a combat medic though, a little bit different. But how did doing this over the years maybe affect you? And how were you able to kind of swallow all these stories night after night and not let it, kind of affect your mojo, I guess? Yeah.
2 answers. One is I had my own support network. My husband, again, at the time, federal corrections officer. So great. At the end of our days, we had, great stories to share.
I can't imagine.
Because he worked at the penitentiary of the Florence facility. So really a lot of the top people. So one was be able to just dump and say like, oh, this is what my day was like today. And this is how hard it was. And as well as the team I was in. So we would debrief calls and we would be able to kind of go together and say this, this is what was going on. This is what could have been better or different or whatever. So having my own social networks was incredibly helpful. The other, unfortunately, is I did get burned out. So I'm not in that role anymore for a reason. I loved that role. And in the right circumstances, I would go back in a heartbeat. But eventually that did get tapped out for me. And I chose to switch roles around that point. But I did respond to somebody who's experiencing houselessness. And I remember having less emotion than I normally would. And I kind of caught myself in that moment and realized, hey, early vital sign, right? Something's changed. Something's different. I'm not as in tune to this connection that I want to be. And so the Institute opened right around that time, coincidentally, and I was able to shift roles. But I had to be really introspective to myself at that time too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something I've heard a lot of in every kind of first responder type job. You become numb to something that would cause the average person like a lifetime worth of bad nightmares.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough place to be because you volunteer for that position. You want to be helping those people, both in your position, a firefighter, now he's walking into a burning building and not feeling anything. You have a paramedic, mangled body, and he's just numb doing his work. That's a tough place to be. Mm-hmm. And that's its own trauma or PTS, if you will. Mm-hmm. Would you kind of classify it as that?
Oh, 1,000,000%, yes. Yeah. I think what's also hard is some of those experiences end up being impactful or hard because it's not what we thought we signed up for.
Right.
If you talk to a lot of firefighters, they actually don't spend a whole lot of time fighting fires. They go to a myriad of other calls, right? Paramedics,
chest pain,
exactly, chest pain, mental health calls, kids in storm drains, things like that. Like you're not actually fighting fires as often. Obviously they do, but not as often as what you signed up for. I think the same can be said with police officers. I work with a lot of police officers, and sometimes it's, I signed up to be like this badass and I'm doing this, right? And that's not, it's this cognitive dissonance that's happening. Military, obviously the same. You signed up to be Superman, and then reality looks a little different, more often than not.
There's a lot of veterans listening right now nodding their head. The cognitive dissonance that happens with joining the military. I was going to, be an engineer and blow bridges up, and all I've done is mop floors for 2 years.
Right.
Cognitive dissonance in a nutshell. Yeah.
That's hard for the brain to reconcile with.
Tell me about the Lyda Hill Institute a little bit. I know you guys have a research department as well as a very practical, like what would you even call it, the clinic? Like you guys are practicing as well. So you have research and then you have practical application.
Yes.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yes. So we have three divisions. It was originally when we opened, it was 3 divisions. So we've collapsed 2 of them. So yes, we have research and we have research affiliates all over the world studying trauma in some way or form. Both from, all the way from like medical trauma and what's going on in your body. We have an environmentalist who looks at like mosquito and trauma and all like really fascinating work in the Southern Hemisphere. And then we have, of course, mental health trauma. So research going on all the time. We have our community training division, which is what I was overseeing before we collapsed it. And that is where we go out and what we do what I like to call trauma literacy. So just understanding what stress and trauma is, what it happens to your body. Importantly, what do you do about it, right? How do you recover? What are those key resilience skills? We have tons of programs, peer support, trauma training, different workshops, lots of ways we teach trauma skills. And then we have our healing division, which is our Veteran Health and Trauma Clinic. That's a clinic that's been open for 11 years where we we provide psychotherapy, treat trauma. We have specific trauma treatment modalities. All of our providers are specifically trained in trauma. With that program, we see just about 300 clients a month with all of our providers. And then in 2023, summer of 2023, we opened Milestones Resilience Care Center. This is a whole person holistic care for anybody who's experienced trauma. So in addition to trauma-focused psychotherapy, we also have trauma-specific massage, acupuncture, yoga, outdoor immersion, so different kind of like forest bathing, mindfulness hikes, things like that, creative expressions with writing, art, and sound healing, and then group work and animal assisted. So you mentioned equine. We do equine therapy as well as llama therapy, which is new and very interesting. Yeah. So within that program, we do, it's a 42 session model where somebody comes in and has autonomy and choice. And it's kind of like that spa feel. If you come in and you get to choose your services, it's a little bit of that. Obviously guided by clinical expertise as well, but that's an amazing program that we've been working through with the last 2 years. If your viewers aren't aware of Next Chapter, that's a program that we were working with that sent 28 veterans through the Next Chapter program through Milestones, and we saw incredible results in our assessments, going from clinical PTSD in the start of the 42 sessions to not even diagnosable at the end. Same thing with anxiety, depression. We saw huge increases in self-efficacy for coping through trauma, increases in social support, increases in power and purpose and meaning scales. So really, really cool results from that.
Let's talk about some of the specific modalities that you've seen working and that you guys are using these days. Yeah.
So I'll brag on this one because I actually just got to try this one out. But we have massage healers, right? So massage therapy. And one of our providers does neuropathy healing. So she's able to work with individuals who have had concussions and TBI and work with their cognitive symptoms through massage. So the way the body reacts to certain experiences, the way your nerves are connected, she's able to really kind of work through some of those through touch, which has been fascinating. So she does a lot of work, and her husband was Special Forces himself. So she's done a lot of work with veterans. And then acupuncture, similar. So how do you kind of target trauma through acupuncture? And this is really honoring, again, that whole person, whole body experience of trauma, that it's not all in your head.
Right.
Your body is feeling this. The way that your body holds on to pain and trauma experiences can manifest in really, really fascinating ways. So through doing all of that kind of work, we're able to heal trauma in just a different light.
Do you have a favorite or one that you've seen just working exponentially more than others?
No, it really depends on the person and what you're comfortable with. What I love about it too is, again, let's think about the injury, right? If you have a knee injury, there's a lot of different ways you can heal your knee injury. You can go straight to the doctor, right? Straight to the physical therapist, chiropractor, whoever your doctor is. You could ice it, you could elevate it, you could rest it, you could do all sorts of things to heal this injury or to treat this injury. And we think about post-traumatic stress, same thing. There's a lot of different ways you can work on this. And so for some people, I don't want to talk about it, and that's totally fine. Don't talk about it yet. Right? Let's work through some other avenues first. And then as that starts to feel more comfortable, as you start to release your trauma, your experiences through touch or through equine, you start to understand your behavior differently. Then the idea of talking about it doesn't feel as big, as intimidating. And within our clinic, most of those services are all happening in the same environment. So again, that stigma hopefully reduces a little bit as well.
How about some specific modalities, CBT, DBT, exposure therapy? What's kind of your insight on those three?
So I myself am trained in cognitive behavior therapy and cognitive processing therapy, kind of very similar modalities. A lot of our therapists are trained in EMDR, or eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, and then prolonged exposure. Those are kind of the four, and dialectic behavior therapy. Those are the five kind of most common trauma treatments.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of cognitive behavior therapy, and not everybody is, but I really like it because, again, a lot of my work is on dumb, smart brain. So when you think about how you think about a situation and how those thoughts impact your behavior and vice versa, there's a lot of really cool ways you can get out of that way of thinking. Honestly, more often than not, as soon as you realize you're not thinking in a helpful way, your brain kind of snaps right out of it. And so it's a really nice kind of foundation to start with. And then we start building into, okay, now when you think about your trauma, what are some of the thoughts that come into that? And there's a lot of, skills in between all of that.
So what would a CBT session look like?
Yeah. So the way I usually start is after a few sessions of getting to know each other, I go into what are called cognitive distortions. There's 10 to 12, depending on kind of what list you're looking at, but 10 to 12 cognitive distortions, which again are just maladaptive ways of thinking. An easy one is like black and white thinking, that things are right or wrong, they're good or they're bad.
Oh, yeah. Like catastrophizing.
Yep, catastrophizing. Okay. Mind reading is another. So we go into a situation and we immediately think we know how it's going to turn out or what someone's going to tell us. And again, we just tend to skew towards the negative, which is just not always helpful. Do you know all 12 of them? Not off the top of my head. Let's
try and list as many as we can. This is super interesting.
Black and white thinking.
Right.
Catastrophizing was one. Let's see. All or nothing thinking. I think that actually goes hand in hand with catastrophizing. Right. It's all or nothing. Should statements. So things should be this way, shouldn't be this way. Fortune telling, and that kind of goes hand in hand with mind reading as well. So again, I think I know what the situation is going to turn into. Let's see, discounting the positive, where we always go towards the negative. We skip over the positive events in our life, or disqualifying the positive. That's all I can immediately think of.
That's all good. I've been through a couple of CBT sessions, and the ones that resonated with me was catastrophizing and mind reading.
Yes.
It's like because you can combine those two, right? Like I know that this is going to be worst case scenario. So now I've mind read the future and catastrophized the future, but it's just the truth in my head.
Yeah. And in doing so, you're kind of left feeling anxious or just bad, right? Because we're just waiting for that bad thing to happen. Yeah. It's dumb, smart brain, right? If we are always primed for the bad, then it'll always help us survive. So that's, great in theory. Not fun to live.
No.
Right?
No.
And the thing we don't think about it often with our survival brain is with our sympathetic nervous system, we are designed to survive, quote unquote, for 5 minutes. right? If we think about running from a bear or fighting the bear or whatever from the bear, that should last like 5 to 10 minutes. And in nature, that's exactly what happens. We run away from our predator, we chase down our prey, and in 5 to 10 minutes, one of two things is done. We have been fed or we have escaped, right? And in theory, 24 to 48 hours later, that maybe happens again, right? But in our brain, our human brain, and how often we turn on that sympathetic nervous system, it's happening all the time. So dumb, smart brain goes, okay, well, if I'm always running from a bear, then I will just always be prepared for the bear. But our body wasn't designed to do that. And so that's when we start to see all of that breakdown. Again, we're not designed to run constantly for 24 hours. Our body will start to break down from that. And so very similar way to think about it. So when we think about cognitions like that, negative cognitions, it's just our brain's just trying to help us. It's just not helping us in a very helpful way anymore.
Yeah.
So the way I like to think about it, again, usually as soon as you realize you're doing it, you can snap right out of it. The other piece is, I don't want to say don't think about those things. Catastrophize, sure. Just spend like a minute on it.
Right.
And then be fair to yourself and spend a minute thinking about the best case scenario. Just balance it out.
Yeah.
Right. And it kind of undoes some of that pathway that the brain's trying to do.
Is this way of thinking kind of like a muscle? Because I could imagine this would be hard. Like, because I'm just thinking in my own life, you know, I'm a avid catastrophizer. I'm very good at like, you know, countering it. But at first, like if you've lived your whole life this way, or especially if in the military, when, you know, well, what if we get shot at today? That might be a catastrophizing ideology, but then it happened and people died. Now it's like, I think we're going to get shot at every time I leave my house.
Right.
And now you're in this really skewed way of thinking forever.
Right.
So this is definitely something difficult to reprogram this muscle, to rebuild it. You have any kind of advice on how to do it?
Yeah. So I have a couple of ways I want to go down that. So remind me if I get lost on this, but a couple of ways. One is that, again, to validate and normalize what's happening right in that moment. Your brain's helping you survive. If it is always cued for an incoming bomb, great, I'm going to run away from that bomb that much faster, right? If we think about if you've ever like been on a run or riding your bike and you see a stick and you startle because your brain goes, well, what if it's a snake, right? Great. Then I survived that snake, but turned out it was a stick. Now, if I continue to see sticks every 15 feet and I'm startling for each one, that's not a fun bike ride anymore, right? So on one hand, the brain is simply trying to do what it thinks you need. If I am always prepared for the bear, for the bomb, for the whatever, then I'm that much safer. So we don't blame the brain. You're doing great, right? It's just not helpful anymore. So eventually you're no longer on deployment. Eventually you are home. Eventually you're just walking a trail. And we have to retrain our brain to say that's not a snake, that's a stick, right? That's not an incoming bomb, that is a helicopter, or that's an airplane, whatever that other option is. We have to retrain our brain to say that. And that is absolute hard work because your brain has gotten really used to helping you survive. So analogy, right? I'm a big analogy person.
Love it.
The way I like to think about the brain is plastic. We can change brain pathways all the way up into old age, right? When we're babies, when we're growing up, we have millions and millions and millions of neural connections that are happening constantly, which is why we're learning so much all the time. As we get into adulthood, that starts to slow down, but it's still happening. So if you can visualize this for me real quick, if say that you have a habit, catastrophizing, right? When you think of a situation, your brain immediately goes to worst case scenario. That's great. It's helping you survive. Cool. Imagine yourself, that path in your brain. Imagine that like you're walking down a trail in a forest and you are super used to that trail. You know every single boulder. You know exactly when it bends. You know exactly when it starts to slope downhill. You know what trees to duck under. Very, very worn path. Eventually you're walking in this path and you look to your left and you realize there's this like gorgeous lake over here. But to get there, you have to forge a new path, right? And so as you're like, yeah, but it's worth it. I want to see the lake. So you start to go down this other path, but you've never been on this path before. And so what ends up happening is you slip on the rock and your face gets smacked by a branch and you realize, oh, there's a ravine here I wasn't prepared for and I fall a little bit and I have to climb this hill. And eventually I reach this lake and wow, that was really gorgeous and I want to do that again. So the next time I go down the forest, I realize I have this well-worn path that I could go down and I know my feet can take me there immediately. Or I remember there's this lake over here. But to get back to the lake, I have to go back down that path where I might get smacked in the face by a branch. But the more that happens, the more I choose this other path, the more worn down that one gets. And eventually I'm going to get to the point where as I walk through the forest, I have two options. I could catastrophize, or I could choose not to. And I could choose to walk down this other path. And eventually, the less I go down the catastrophizing route, the more overgrown that one becomes. And my brain stops going to that one as often.
Oh, I see.
Yep.
I've heard a lot of analogies in this realm. One that I heard that I also like is you walk down this alley on the way to work every single day, and now all of a sudden there's a huge hole in this alley. So you fall in the hole.
Yeah.
Someone shows up, rescues you, pull you out. The next day, you walk down this alley and you bring a ladder with you. Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's just, that's your first way of kind of overcoming this obstacle. Like, well, I got to go through the hole. I'll bring a ladder so I can go down it, over, and then up the other side.
Sure.
The next day there's another, like, something stupid. Maybe you have a bridge, you lay the ladder over it. So now you don't even have to walk in the hole. And then, the fourth day you just realize, wait, I could just take a different way to work.
Yeah.
So there's so many analogies for this. I really like it. But yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah. And you think, some of us have like that really positive person in your life where like, no matter what you say, they're just like, they're just like happy jolly, right? They just go with the flow. Their pathway is towards the positive. And that's the way they immediately start to think.
Yeah.
And so it's just an encouragement for us you can choose to think of it differently. And again, to validate and normalize why your brain goes down the one path, right? It's because one time it went down that path and you survived the bear.
Yeah.
So great. Let's do that every time.
Right.
But eventually the bear's gone.
Yeah. I want to make a comment to that about you have that one person in your life who's happy. Let's go back to where they called mirroring neurons.
Yes.
How relevant is this in our social group? So, for example, we have we'll just keep it very broad here, our happy, positive friends, and we have our gossiping, negative friends. We all have many of both. But how do those mirroring neurons come into play when we're with both parties?
Exactly that. You're co-regulating species, right? Mirror neurons are going to match the environment that we're in. Sometimes, being in like the venty, gossipy space feels fine because it's like, I don't have to worry about my problems. I can kind of like think about somebody else's.
I can just hear about everyone else's.
Yeah, and that kind of feels nice
Yeah.
and great. But eventually it stops feeling good.
Yeah.
I don't want to just hear about the drama. I don't want to hear about the negativity. So we do, I think while we tend to skew towards the negative, I also think we crave the positive, which is why spending time with friends who are really positive, that we're not spending a lot of time talking about work or the doom and gloom, feels really good for us.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think society, especially social media, really harnesses the power of negativity. When we think about like TikTok and Instagram Reels and all of the other stuff, we can literally flip through doom and gloom every 5 seconds. And then the algorithm learns that and it continues to give us that. But the opposite is true. If we, only look at videos of happy puppies, the algorithm's like, fine, that's the one I'll give you, right? But that feels good to us too. So I think it's just recognizing what space do you want to be in.
Yeah. I'm not going to get started about social media though. I want to do a whole episode on that. Yeah, it's the downfall of humanity.
Oh, 1,000,000% over. Yes.
How much do you know about your guys' GRIT program and the philosophies behind it?
Well, I created the program, so I know a lot about it.
My apologies.
Because I know a lot about it. So GRIT stands for the Greater Resilience Information Toolkit. Really, we just liked the word grit and we tried to find some words that fit it. But it is kind of a light version of peer support. The way I like to describe it is kind of like basic first aid for social support. It just teaches anybody and everybody how to reach out and say, hey, how are you? And actually pause and have that conversation. We started the program in March of 2020. So literally as the pandemic was closing everything in our country, Dr. Benight, Chip, called me. So I'd been running our peer support programs for several years by that point. And I love the power of peer and everything that peer support does. And he called me up in March of 2020 and he said, hey, I just keep thinking as the word social distancing gets stronger and stronger, as all of these policies and regulations are coming in, we are isolating, right? As a country, we're withdrawing. It's not good for us, right? Again, we think about research time and time again, social support's the most powerful factor. As we start isolating, that's going to have negative reverberations.
You guys are thinking about this.
Yeah. Wow. And I think he also kind of had that awareness. He's worked in the field, he's worked in disaster and trauma for a very long time. So I think he was also aware that while everyone is like, it's going to be over by April, it's going to be over by May, I think he knew it wasn't, right? Because of when we think about disaster trajectories, this is considered a disaster. It's not going to be over in 3 months like everyone's hoping. Mm-hmm. So I think he had kind of this forethought to think if we don't intervene now, we're going to get real down as a country. We're going to get real sad here and really, really isolated. And that's not good for us. And so how do we bring in the idea of peer support? But importantly, how do we do it as a population, right? Crisis response models are really helpful when they work. Oftentimes what happens after a disaster is companies or crisis organizations come in a few weeks later. They bring in a ton of very, very much needed helpful resources and support. And then a few weeks, months later, they leave. Unfortunately, trauma doesn't work that way. We sometimes aren't ready to receive the help a few weeks after the event happened. Sometimes it's not until years later. Sometimes we're not done recovering when the resources leave. So this model, while I think incredibly well-intended and very, very helpful for those it can reach, it cannot and will not reach everybody. And so there was that awareness too. And so how do we increase social support as a population, and how do we start tapping into peer support for everybody? So that's where the idea of GRIT came along. So originally we reduced our 40-hour peer support training to 5 to see, well, what are some of just the basic concepts we can teach somebody. Really importantly, this call to action to say, go talk to somebody, go reach out. We had this message of, as you're taking this training, who are you thinking of? Because you're probably thinking of somebody. And after this training, call them and just have that conversation and just see where that goes. So that's really where the idea of GRIT was born. In April 2020, we launched our first class. It was just hey, whoever, our own affiliates, whoever knows about us, come take this training, see what you think. And then it rapidly snowballed. Immediately in May, we started getting, so this again, first class in April. In end of April and May, we started getting requests from teachers and education to saying like, hey, I'm suffering. My students are suffering. My colleagues are suffering. This is something we never expected, and we don't know how to walk this world, right? Where all of a sudden everything's virtual. And so we adapted the program called Grit for Education, which was all about how do you support educators in this space. And then in the summer, we got more requests from small business owners and leadership to say, I don't know how to support my employees because we're still virtual and everybody's sad and this is really hard. So we adapted it again. And since then, we've continued to adapt it. So now it is a 2.5-hour program. So we condensed it a little bit shorter and make it even more tangible. It's completely online and self-paced. And we have Grit Core, which is that 2.5 hour. These are the basic skills. And then we have 4 additional modules. We have education that stayed. Within education, there's an idea called 3 Around Me, which is that if we can surround every youth with 3 helpful, watchful adults, we have a higher chance of catching signs of stress and trauma. We have Grit Lead for leaders and small business owners, Grit for Health, which is all about healthcare, and then Grit Serve, which is for our military and emergency responders. We are actually currently adapting it a 5th time to, that'll be called Grit Care, which is how do caregivers support one another. We've also translated the entire program into Spanish, and all of it's continued to be available online for free.
And anyone, anywhere can access
Anyone, everywhere.
It. So how do you get involved? How do you take the course? Yeah,
it's just grit.uccs.edu. You sign up, immediately you get access to the class, and you can go through any and all modules at your pace. We have 5,100 people who have taken it all around the world. So all 50 states and 40 different countries at this point who have taken the training.
Okay. We'll put that training in the show notes so anyone listening can definitely check it out. I apologize. I didn't know you had created it.
It's okay. It's okay. I was just teasing you. I like to say Grit's my first baby.
Yeah.
Right. No, but I have a strong passion for the power of peer and that ability to just connect. I think we've gotten as a society into this bad habit of what I call drive-by check-ins, right? That if I see you and you're my neighbor or you're my colleague and I see you on the street and I say, hey, how are you? How are things going? I don't actually pause to hear your answer because it's become more of a greeting for us. And oftentimes what can happen is right? You might want to say like, oh, actually things aren't going well or I'm struggling or whatever, I've had a tough weekend, whatever that might be, but I haven't paused to hear your answer. So Grit encourages us to slow down, to say, no, how are you actually doing? What's actually going on in your life right now? And then importantly, it does 2 things. One, we focus on harnessing strengths. So what's going well in your life? because again, our skew towards the negative, we want to pull that towards positive and think about if these are going well in this realm of your life, how can you apply some of those pieces into what's not going so well? And then importantly, how do we share resources? So there are so many amazing resources. But a common complaint I had myself when I was working in crisis is there's almost too many and I don't even know where to start. And for somebody who already feels overwhelmed with what's happening, the idea of asking for help or what's the next step can add to that overwhelm. So for somebody else to come in and say, hey, why don't you try this? Or hey, I heard about this or whatever, to share those resources, hopefully we can get those accesses a lot faster.
Yeah, absolutely. What an amazing thing. Great job.
Thank you. Yeah, we love it. I'm really, really proud of it.
Yeah. A question I enjoy asking people who are just in the helping business is to share an inspirational story of someone you watched maybe go from rock bottom to some kind of success outcome. Do you have anyone that comes to mind? And you can keep names out of it for HIPAA, but.
No, yeah. I mean, I think my brother is one. It's a big one. And I've already shared that story. There's been, I myself have gone through a lot of significant stress and trauma. And when I think about, the life I've been through and the things I've been through, the pieces that stand out the most is who rallied around me. So that was always my call as well of, who was in my corner when I was in my lowest. But I see that in a lot of different clients I work with too, is oftentimes there's one or two people, right? When you think about who's in your corner, who's helping you, there's usually one or two people that stand out for them and then really kind of capitalizing on those relationships.
So you had like a certain one or two people in your life that no matter what you were going through, they just were there no matter what.
Yeah. And to have that, I can be whoever I am in this moment and you'll accept me is really powerful.
What would you say to someone who maybe doesn't have that?
That there's always somebody that could be.
But it's scary to go find them, right?
Oh, yeah. Terrifying. Because again, this idea that I have to think, again, we don't have to say like something's wrong, but there's the feeling or the idea that I have to admit that something's wrong. And that can feel really intimidating or scary. Or that fear of rejection, I think is very true. If I don't want somebody to reject who I am or what I'm going through as I'm in, one of my most vulnerable states.
Yeah. Do you have any recommendations? Maybe this kind of goes back to your principles of grit, but, someone who is a loner doesn't have someone really solidified in their life that they feel like they could call and say, hey, I'm having an issue. What recommendations would you have for starting to move in that direction, starting to foster a relationship or a small community? What recommendations would you have?
Sure. Two, I think I have two recommendations. One is I think as what is the word I'm looking for? As like I have nobody and I need somebody now. That immediacy, that's the word. For that immediacy, what people don't often realize about crisis lines is that they're answered by a live person, and most of them channel you to a more local person too. So in Colorado, if you call like 988, you're getting connected to somebody in Colorado. And so that's really powerful to that it's going to be answered by a real person, and you can spend as much time as you need talking to that real person. Crisis walk-in centers, similarly, they're 24/7. You can go and you can talk to a real person. So that immediacy to know that even if you feel like there's nobody, there is somebody.
Right.
The other piece is the power behind like community and social groups, right? Support groups exist for a reason. Some really, really phenomenal community groups exist. And even if you don't have a one-on-one connection, to get into a group, you can start to make those connections and you start to realize I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone in this experience, or I'm not alone in this feeling. There's other people who maybe haven't walked my same shoes, but have walked pretty similar ones and connection from there.
For sure. Yeah, that's actually our motto on the show is you're not alone. So we just try and have conversations that just reiterate that you're not alone. This is another example. So
yeah, peer support is another fantastic avenue. And there's a lot of really cool programs that connect you with a peer. One that we've worked with that actually uses grit as one of their trainings is called Sound Off. It's a veteran group for anybody who's in the military to get connected to somebody else in the military. So even if, again, you don't want to, if joining like a community group or a local group also still feels a little bit too much, which is totally fair, you can anonymously connect with somebody that you at least knows you or knows this experience. So Sound Off is a really cool program.
Yeah, it's an app, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, and again, they use grit as one of their recommended trainings.
Cool. What's the future hold for you? What kind of direction do you kind of see your work going?
Yeah, I love where I'm at. I have no plans to leave where I'm at. I would love to grow both our clinical practices and our community trainings and kind of be the source for trauma treatment. I think Milestones is doing some just incredible work, and I'm so proud of the Veteran Health and Trauma Clinic and the thousands of people we've served. I just want to continue to expand us and help as many as we can. Is
there an area within psychology and PTSD and trauma work in general that you think needs to be developed more or researched more?
I think that there's a really, really interesting and really great space for prevention of trauma symptoms. I think that's not something we talk about enough, is how preventative and how early intervention trauma work can be done. Really, I think the more we educate each other on what is considered trauma, what's considered stress, how to very quickly work through some of those experiences, how, like coping skills wise, we don't ever have to get down the path of PTSD. Now, sometimes you still might, because again, there's brain work happening. But if we can get onto early intervention strategies, there's really a lot of opportunity for growth and for strength, for post-traumatic growth and strength there. So I'd love to see a lot more work done in that. I myself really enjoy the work of self-efficacy, which is, again, how you're thinking about the situation and growth mind and things like that. So I would love to see more work done in the early space of trauma.
Yeah. What might be some like surface level ideas there? And the first thing that came to mind, if you do like more meditating or more mindfulness type work because you're in a job that it may cause PTSD, like military, first responder, et cetera. You spend more time in your own head and just understanding your own emotions. So when that time comes, you already have that down. That's the first thing that came to my mind.
That's exactly it, though. Yeah. If you are training for a marathon, let's keep using that injury analogy. If you're training for a marathon, you're also hyper aware of things like knee injuries, ankle injuries, shoulder injuries, right? Like how your body is mobile. And there's hopefully an awareness that if I strain my body in training for whatever I'm training for, I am susceptible to an injury. Again, same kind of language can be applied to trauma. If I am exposed to potentially traumatic situations, then I have a chance of developing an injury. It doesn't mean that it has to be a life-altering injury. It doesn't mean that this has to be career-ending for me. It just means that I need to be aware of it. And if I can be aware of it, and importantly, if I can pick up on the early vital signs that something's changing and I can treat that, then it doesn't have to get worse than that. It, again, still might, because we're human and sometimes things get stuck along the way, but it reduces that chance. Similarly, again, if I work out, if I train for marathons and I stretch beforehand and I warm up before I go on a run, or after I stretch and I cool down, it reduces my chances of an injury. So when I think about emergency responder populations and military populations, I often teach this of what's your warm up? What's your cool down? How are you taking care of your body? Right. Again, sharing that my husband was a corrections officer, we purposefully lived an hour away from his work because he had an hour of prep where he would listen to really heart increasing music. He would get himself literally pumped up to be in this environment for the next 8 to 16 hours.
Wow.
Right. And then on his way home, he had an hour where he could come down from that.
Jazz music.
Exactly. No, where he literally he would listen to podcasts and audiobooks, and he would literally just come down. So when we think about your nervous system, what's your warm up? What's your cool down? And it really can make a difference. Now, again, sometimes things get stuck along the way, but it reduces your chance.
Right. Well, last thing I'll ask you, what would you say to someone who's struggling? Maybe they felt themselves isolating over the past few months or years, and they can kind of, feel themselves slipping down a little bit. What would you say to them?
Start small, right? I think sometimes we get this maybe fear or intimidation that if I do have to ask for help, or if I do have to change something, if I have to admit something happened, then the next step feels big, and it doesn't. It doesn't have to be. Start really small, right? Start on 5 minutes of mindfulness, right? We poo-poo it, but I encourage everybody, especially a military and emergency responder listening to this, I highly encourage you to check out That meditation. It's on YouTube. It's 2.5 minutes long. It's a 2.5 minute long meditation. Okay. Very, very effective, very helpful. Because meditation and mindfulness does not have to be this kumbaya, think nothing kind of experience. A lot of different ways we can engage in that. But start small. Talk to one person, right? Go for one intentional walk. Engage in 5 minutes of mindfulness. Check out one community group, whatever that might be, but start small. Dumb smart brain. If we if we realize help is possible, if we know we could get better, we are much more likely to do that. But to do that, we really have to start small. A lot of New Year's resolutions don't work or aren't effective because we reached too high, right? I want to lose 50 pounds. I want to change my life completely. I want to buy a new house. Great, wonderful goals. Let's have those goals, but start small in them. Start with 5 pounds, start with 1 mile, start with reducing one debt, whatever that might be, but you start small. And then as your brain realizes that I can meet that smaller challenge, then I feel more efficacious to meet the next challenge.
Yeah, small successes lead to confidence to achieve the ultimate goal, which maybe is, I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to drink anymore. I don't want to do something anymore. But it's those small successes that lead to the confidence to actually see the goal out.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, Nicole, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
This is
thanks
a great
for having
conversation. You've done amazing work. So just want to let you know, I'm proud of you. There's a whole bunch of people that are just backing you up on this kind of stuff. So someone has to do it. You've done it. You've answered the call. So we just appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. And for anybody who's looking for help or looking for that small step, just know it's out there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.